So community-based conservation. Community-based conservation is kind of starting in the 90s to a great degree, started to be kind of touted as an alternative model to fortress conservation, to just putting up a fence and saying, we don't use this area and we're going to protect it forever. Community-based conservation, the idea there is that you have protected areas where local people are seriously brought into the management of that area. And as you might imagine, that can range from almost tokenistic, hey, we're putting in a protected area, but here's some jobs we're going to let you have in the park. It can range from that to actually sincere, like bottom up grassroots kind of like, let's all talk together, perhaps as a state or national government with local people and figure out what we want this protected area to look like. And a lot of things kind of fall somewhere in between those two extremes, perhaps a little bit more, unfortunately, towards the first end. But the idea would be protected areas where there's a clear benefit for the community and where the community would hopefully have more tie-in, right? So the solution to fortress-based conservation, and it perhaps not working, because again, you can never police everything, is to instead make an area that people actually feel like works for them, that they like being there, that they are voluntarily living their usage of, and that then it becomes a collaborative effort rather than what we sometimes call a top-down conservation effort. This idea of community-based conservation is often tied in with certain kinds of ideas, such as like sustainable agroforestry or different things like that, which has its own controversies, but is nonetheless a notable idea. Kind of this idea of, can we do sustained resource use in this area? Maybe not just out and about full scale resource use, but is there a way that community users can still use this land? Another thing that often gets worked into community-based conservation ideas is ecotourism. The idea that, well, if we're not going to allow people to, let's say, turn this land into ranches, or turn this land into farms, or turn this land into buildings, could we instead make it a tourist destination? And then when tourists get here, it could be locals that are the tour guides, locals that are the owners of restaurants and hotels and things like that at the outskirts of the park. And so that's sometimes presented in the conservation world as kind of this really good alternative to what we call extractive uses, to things like where you're actually taking all the timber or mining it or something like that. How about instead a tourism model, which in theory it can be a good idea, right? If that's something that people actually want, not if it's being forced on them, but if that's something where people actually want and they say, yeah, we would love tourist jobs in our community, that would bring in good money from outside the community and allow us to preserve a forest, which, by the way, we were preserving just fine before a big national government came along. Sometimes that's something that communities feel really good about. Sometimes it's not. So that's kind of the idea there with ecotourism as part of community-based conservation, that it's an alternative to more extractive uses. It gets defined by the International Ecotourism Society as responsible travel to natural areas that conserves the environment, sustains the well-being of the local people, and involves interpretation and education. So ecotourism doesn't always have to be community-based. It can be very much top-down and people getting their land taken. And conversely, community-based conservation doesn't have to involve ecotourism. It could involve, let's say, we're going to allow people still to hunt in this area, but only if they're actual locals and not people from far away. But often there is an overlap there, because the idea is that if we can get good tourism industries going, that can help people to have an economic alternative to extractivism, to stripping the resources from the land. And so that's the idea there with some international protected areas. And sometimes it works well and sometimes it doesn't. You read a case study about that from Teresa Trusty called From Ecosystem Services to Unfulfilled Expectations, Factors Influencing Attitudes Towards the Madidi Protected Area. And it is talking about an area in Bolivia, which is currently about 18,000 square kilometers large. It is an important area, among other things, as a habitat corridor for jaguars. What we mean by a habitat corridor is when a place connects to other large forests or something like that and allows movement. Habitat corridors are all the rage in conservation biology because they, if done right, in theory, help the two populations to interbreed with each other. So you keep the genetics strong and reduce the possibility of like genetic bottlenecks where the species starts to get inbred in one park, right? So if you have like two parks that are connected by some kind of like foresty area, suddenly you've really got one huge population instead of two isolated smaller populations. So anyways, the Madidi protected area was put in place by Bolivia, and Teresa Trusty kind of studied people's responses to it, local people, local farmers in particular. And what she found was that on some level, it did work as a community-based conservation project. It was being promoted by outdoor conservation groups who were working with the Bolivian government, right? To kind of put in place this new protected area, but they kind of selected it in a place where people didn't use it as much, right? If you think of a traditional group territories, there'll sometimes be places that are more or less heavily used. So they kind of found a place where nobody like had their homes or their farms really. It was more of like a hunting area. They also used phased restrictions, by which I mean they didn't just say nobody's allowed in the park, which is very much fortress conservation. Nobody's allowed in unless you get a park permit and you're just here to take pictures. Instead, they had kind of like zones as you got closer to the core of the habitat that you wanted to protect. But even as you're getting close to it, they were still allowing certain kinds of uses like hunting as long as it was done sustainably. So, you can't farm here, but you can hunt here. And then a little bit further away, you can farm here if you're an actual local, but you can't log here, right? So kind of phased restrictions rather than just some sort of blanket carte blanche, humans can't do stuff here. So generally speaking, when she did her research in 2006, 2007, people were pretty okay with the protected area and thought it was just fine. Not only did they think it was just fine, um, but the environmental NGO, the one who had been kind of saying, let's protect this area and working with the government, and I don't know which environmental NGO it is. I don't remember if she names it or not. But anyways, the environmental NGO or non-governmental organization had done a lot of outreach to the local community to kind of say like, hey, here's why this new protected area is being established up in the hills over there. Here's what we think the benefits are. And the NGO really pushed this idea of ecosystem services. Ecosystem services is a term we use for things that are provided by our environment when we preserve it essentially as it is. So for example, and this is the one of the examples the NGO kind of pushed, trees provide, they take in carbon dioxide, they produce oxygen, right? And so that they kind of promoted that as like, hey, this is a good benefit of keeping the park, right? You keep this large stand of trees, and as a result, lots of good oxygen production. And local people really sank their teeth into that idea and started referring to the forests as like lungs of the world and stuff like that. So like that discourse worked for them and made sense to them as a value to preserving this forest and not converting it over into farmland or village land. People also there, it's interesting which ecosystem services maybe somebody living in a city up in the United States might think of when looking at a forest like that. Like they might be thinking, oh, it's carbon sequestration, right? It helps combat global warming to have a forest in place. Locals thought instead, one of the big things that locals thought was valuable was that it worked like a game reserve, although people didn't use that term. But basically the idea that, oh, we hunt the animals and then sometimes some of the animals get away and go into this like protected area you guys set up, and then they can like breed and set up their population and have more kids, and then we've still got animals to hunt next season. So this idea that it was like helping protect the hunting population, which is very interesting. So people really kind of liked that idea of ecosystem services. At the same time, all was not beautiful. In this case, as you read about, among other things, there was concerns over the equity of benefits. There was some amount of tourism dollars coming in, but the question was who it went to, and local people generally felt that not enough of it was coming into the community. There was also that which went into a bigger narrative. Oh, sorry, let me rephrase that it wasn't being distributed evenly enough among the community. And then this also fed into a larger narrative, the idea that, oh, well, if outsiders want to preserve something, aka the NGO and the government, then clearly there must be some like kind of ulterior motive, or like they must be getting a ton of money from tourism that we're not seeing. So there was kind of issues with I don't know if it's that the government and the NGO hadn't communicated properly or negotiated properly on how they were going to handle revenue. I think it was also just something you sometimes get with remote areas versus a government that's based out of a city, which is sort of distrust of the faraway government, right? Understandable and sometimes extremely well justified depending on the situation. And this gives us some take homes if you're thinking about sort of managing an area for ecotourism as a way of helping the environment to not turn into, just as an example, an open pit mine, but instead to kind of be a place that can benefit the community economically without extracting a bunch of resources. This case study gives us some good advice. One of them is outreach is important, right? Outreach is critically important. The NGO didn't just depend on the idea that, oh, of course, anybody would want to preserve the forest that's a few miles away from their towns, but instead actively reached out to people and said, this is why we want to preserve this specific forest. And to add to that, though, outreach ahead of time is much better. It sounds a little bit to me, I don't know the specifics, but it sounded to me when I read this, like the outreach kind of was happening once the area was already established or early on. It is better if outreach is as early as humanly possible, in my opinion. Even better if people have an actual say, if it's not just outreach, but a dialogue about a protected area. Whether or not that's legally required, if we're true about actually wanting a thing to be community-based, even if it takes longer with public dialogue, and it most likely will, that is still, I think, an important piece of the puzzle in making sure that it's done equitably and in a way that people invest in and protect over the long term. And then emphasizing benefits is important, helping people to see the benefits of this, right? There's relatively few groups that want to destroy nature just for funsies, but a lot of times local groups might feel economically compelled, right? The community might not have very many economic options, and allowing a mining company to come in gives them some jobs, or doing some slash and burn ranching allows them to make some money, right? So if you can instead think of, if governments, conservation organizations, even just like local leaders, like local mayors that they talked about in this, can think through, well, what are the benefits? Are there benefits to locals, which hopefully there are, or why are we doing this on some level? And then how do we explain those benefits to people so that they clearly understand and feel invested in this? Now, all of this assumes that locals don't already understand the benefits of conserving their own resources, and that's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting instead, though, that people sometimes feel compelled to unsustainably use a place, even if they love it and care for it and cherish it, because of things like structural poverty, and that making sure that there's an actual good kind of tourism alternative or something can sometimes be a way of helping people to feel like there's a meaningful alternative, that they can still preserve the space they would like to preserve in a condition similar to what they received it in. I won't super go into this other than to suggest that, sustainable development, the idea emerged post-World War II of international development, the idea of sort of more prosperous nations helping less prosperous nations to industrialize and economically develop more. There's been a lot of critiques of that, less so the idea, more so the practice of it, and the idea of structural adjustment, where groups like the World Bank or IMF will donate money to less prosperous nations, but then have strings attached, like, oh, now you need to all grow soy because soy is what the global market needs. Now you can see where that potentially, one could interpret that as, oh, evil IMF trying to just absorb the entire world into capitalism, industrialism, hegemony, or you could view it as, if you're trying to help a nation economically increase its standard of living, it makes sense to have ways that they would then make that sustainable rather than just a loan of money. And yet, nonetheless, when it's not voluntary and when it's essentially compelled, if you accept the money, you can see how a lot of people have ethical qualms and issues with that. So there's the structural adjustment critique. On the other hand, the idea that we just shouldn't think at all about nations that have a higher economic standard of living working with nations with a lower standard of living, that can sometimes sound appealing, right? Every nation just do its own thing. Let's not mess around in each other's business, right? That's neo-colonialism, that's appropriation, that's integration into the capitalist system, right? We can make all those critiques, but then on a practical level, there are parts of this world where there's immense human suffering because of poverty, essentially, pure and simple, right? Number of children under 5 years of age who suffer from stunted growth, 155 million. Um, Number of children under 5 affected by wasting, basically, they don't weigh enough, they're not big enough, 52 million. Um, Share of the global population who's hungry, 1 in 10. But in some places like Eastern Africa, that's 1 in 3. So in a context like that, I don't think we can say that nations shouldn't be collaborating and trying to come up with economic solutions. The question is always, what does that actually look like, and who has the power in that arrangement? Community-based conservation is sometimes touted as sort of a way that with ecotourism and other sorts of sustainable uses, there can be economic development without this sort of heavy-handed, hey, everybody's growing soy now kind of approach. This works for another day. So in conclusion, we need good solutions for people, and we need good solutions, I think, for protecting our wild populations. And the question is just how you do that well. Is the best approach putting a fence around it? Is the best approach getting local people protecting it? And if that's the case, who gets to decide what areas get protected? Who has the power? And what does it look like? And what role, if any, does tourism play in it? So all of those are important questions to ask. And it's ones that we'll ask in a bit more of a specific way next week when we start talking about Alaska ecotourism and land-based tourism. So see you then.